National Guardsman is shot while he sleeps. Investigators believe it's an accident at first. A newlywed almost becomes a widow as her husband lingers near death. As doctors race to save him, detectives suspect someone was trying to kill him with kindness. Investigating a businessman's murder on a country road, detectives find themselves enmeshed in a tangle of lies and few real clues. In search of answers, they hit the library. Sometimes the least likely suspects are the most likely candidates for committing murder. The so-called fairer sex has been unfairly overlooked when accusations fly. But old stereotypes are being shattered by women who kill. Right now in the United States, more than 3,000 criminals sit on death row for murder. Only 42 of them are women. It's easy to assume that women aren't as inclined to lethal violence. But maybe women are simply better at getting away with it, shielded by our wrong assumptions about what constitutes a killer. But once the manicured finger of suspicion points to them, it's up to forensic investigators to prove their guilt. Early on February 1st, 1988, paramedics in the Durham County, North Carolina Sheriff's Office were called to the home of Barbara and Russell Stagger. There had been a terrible accident. Russell Stagger had been shot in the head while he slept. A .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a spent shell casing lay next to him on the bed. Through her tears, Barbara Stagger explained what happened. Groggy with sleep, she had accidentally fumbled with a gun used for protecting their home against burglars. She had brushed the trigger. The pistol had fired. Though critically wounded, Russell Stagger was still alive. Doctors did everything they could for Stagger, but within hours, the grim prognosis was clear. Barbara was told her husband of 9 years had no hope of recovery. She signed a consent form to take him off life support. Russell Stagger died that afternoon without regaining consciousness. The whole community mourned his loss. Stagger had been well respected in Durham as the high school baseball team's head coach. Once, when the budget for bats and gloves was cut, he took a stand for the team and donated his own money to make up the shortfall. When Stagger wasn't defending his players, he was defending his country as a staff sergeant in the National Guard. Police were prepared to list his death an accident. But his first wife, Lynn Snow, wasn't so sure. She went to police with her suspicions. She'd remained friends with Russell, who told her that his relationship with Barbara had soured, even to the point that he feared for his safety. She urged police not to dismiss the case so quickly. According to Snow, Russell said that Barbara Stagger had a ruinous appetite for cash, clothes, and jewelry. And Russell was never sure where she was getting all her money.
I didn't hardly see him with one.
To check on the first wife's story, investigators questioned other friends of the victim.
He received the best training.
They learned from his fellow National Guardsmen that Russell Stagger was a firearms instructor and extremely cautious around guns. To Police Captain Ricky Buchanan, the questions raised were enough to keep the investigation open.
And nobody with that kind of knowledge about weapons would have slept with one under their pillow, particularly not locked, not cocked, and the safety off. Nobody in their right mind does. But that was what would have had to happen if you believe Barbara's story.
Buchanan wasn't sure he believed it anymore. It was time to look at the widow more closely. Investigators found that arrest warrants had been issued on Barbara Stagger for her chronic check bouncing. She had even forged her husband's name on checks and loan applications. But each time, she somehow managed to pay off her debts and dodge a conviction. Then she would borrow and spend even more, leading to ever more devious ways of getting the cash she craved. She'd written a book called Untimely Death about a man who accidentally killed himself. Though it was fiction, it was based on Barbara's experience with her first husband, Larry Ford. He died in a freak shooting accident 1 year before Barbara married Russell Stagger. Through her writing, Barbara had found a way to cash in on the tragedy.
She sent it to the Doubleday publisher, as I recall. They sent her a rejection letter. But then she took the logo off of the rejection letter and taped it onto a sheet of paper and typed out an acceptance letter where she was going to get, I think, maybe $25,000 advance on the book.
Using the forged letter as collateral, Barbara Stagger secured a bank loan. But curious friends called the publisher to get the book's release date and learned it was rejected. When Russell found out, he managed to forgive Barbara. She returned the $25,000 and the bank didn't prosecute. But to detectives, it seemed that a new target lay squarely in the crosshairs of her ambition. $25,000 would be small change compared to Russell Stagger's life insurance. When all his policies were added up, his death would net this two-time widow more than $200,000. Barbara Stagger was known to lie for money. Buchanan suspected she would kill for it. He knew she fired the fatal bullet. Now he had to prove it was no accident. Barbara had told police she didn't know how to shoot a gun, but Russell Stagger's friends disagreed. They said Barbara was an excellent shot. The victim himself had taught her. It appeared that his lessons may have been turned against him. Investigators knew that if they could find more inconsistencies in Barbara's story, they could build their case. They interviewed all the paramedics, police officers, and doctors who had heard Barbara's account of the accident. But no one had gotten the same story from her. She told paramedics she had reached for the gun when a barking dog made her think a prowler was near the house. She told someone else that her son's alarm had awakened her.
357?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
When the gun had gone off, she'd been putting it away, lest her husband think the boy was a burglar.
And I see him there.
Barbara Stagger was spinning a tangle of lies even she couldn't sort out. But police had a plan to snare her in her own web. To catch a killer, investigators set an ingenious trap. To get Russell Stagger's widow to stick to a story, they asked Barbara Stagger to reenact the accident for them.
Thank you very much.
She was happy to oblige.
Well, Mrs. Stager,
When detectives asked if they could videotape the demonstration,
Sure.
she said yes once
No problem.
again.
That's a big assistance. Thank you very much.
She shot her husband on Monday, and she crawled back in that bed on Friday. And I really don't think a person under normal circumstances would do that if it were an accidental shooting. And she reenacted it for us, and with no emotion, no hesitation.
I don't know how.
This time, Barbara said that while in a sleepy haze, she had pulled out the pistol.
What it was, started to get up, to get it out from under there, heard the noise, shocked, couldn't figure out what it was, sort of realized what had happened, turned over.
She put on her glasses and turned on the light. She cradled her husband's head in her lap, trying to revive him. When paramedics arrived, the victim still lay as if he were asleep, without ever having been moved. It was clear to authorities that Russell Stagger had received no first aid from his wife. In fact, between the time she phoned for help and the arrival of the paramedics, she had gotten dressed, all while her husband lay dying. After her taped performance, the only thing she wanted to know was how the insurance companies would know her husband's death was an accident. She wouldn't see a dime until such a ruling was officially on the books.
Well, thank you. We're not.
Detectives told her a little paperwork still remained. With that, they left.
Now,
They
frankly,
had what they wanted on videotape.
There will never, ever be another gun.
I didn't give her any indication that she made me a happy man by any means. And when I left there, she was certain that it was going to be declared an accidental death. But I knew once she reenacted that we had her.
Detectives studied the videotape of Barbara Stagger's reenactment with an eye toward finding inconsistencies. She had told them the gun had gone off while she held it low next to the bed. Forensic science told a different story. The bullet pierced the lower right portion of the victim's skull and struck above the left eye. Based on his position, this suggested that the gun was tilted downward. But the way Barbara described the accident, the bullet would have moved in an upward trajectory.
And it indicated to us that she was above and behind Russ at the time she pulled the trigger.
That wasn't the only problem with her pantomime. If the pistol had fired under the bed sheets, as Barbara said, there would have been powder burns on the fabric. None were found. That suggested the gun was fired at a distance from the bed. And yet, the cartridge casing was lying next to the victim. Nothing was adding up, but all of it pointed to Barbara's guilt.
How are you? Fine.
It didn't stop there. Police learned that within hours of reenacting the incident, she and two family members presented the victim's will for probate. Though it was signed by Russell Stagger, it was witnessed only by members of Barbara's immediate family.
Says you are the sole proprietor.
The clerk recalled that Barbara showed little emotion during the
We
process.
estimated about $98,000.
When detectives learned how quickly Barbara had tried to push the document through, they examined it as potential evidence. Investigators compared the signature on the will to the victim's National Guard papers. They found that the will had definitely been forged. It was just one more page in Barbara's trail of worthless paper. The inheritance and the insurance money may have been her motive for killing her husband, or she may have just been eager to cash in on Russell's accident. Police needed a more tangible clue to link her to the intentional murder of her husband. Attention focused on the curious proximity of the shell casing to the victim's body. The gun was taken to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab in Raleigh. Experts here evaluate more than 30,000 pieces of evidence annually for state, local, federal, and military law enforcement agencies. In test firing Stagger's gun, investigators found that the bullet casing ejects at least 3.5 feet from the weapon. There was no logical way it could have landed so close to the victim's head, unless Barbara had moved it after she fired. Police learned that similar questions were raised during the death investigation of her first husband 10 years earlier. According to reports at the time of her first husband's death, police noted that the position of the shell casing was suspicious, but it wasn't documented well enough to make a case for homicide. It looked like Barbara was up to her old tricks. This time, she wasn't going to get away with it. Investigators felt they had developed a strong case against Barbara Stagger, but the most compelling piece of evidence was found miles from the scene. One of Russell Stagger's former students found an audio cassette in the high school gym. When it was played, his brother recognized the voice of his ex-coach, Russell Stagger.
Coach Stagger, he died a little while back.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm just being paranoid about all
Oh,
this
man, what are you
stuff.
doing with that? Wait a minute, wait.
Now, you said you had something
They
for
took
me
the
now?
tape to police. On it, Russell Stagger poured out his apprehensions about his wife,
All right.
from her compulsive spending to the death of her first husband and his creeping suspicion that he might be
Who
next.
found it?
The tape, coupled with the crime lab bullet evidence, was enough to bring the case to trial. The prosecution carefully laid out the motives and the events leading to Russell Stagger's death. Barbara's financial problems had come to a head. Without a massive infusion of cash, she would face bankruptcy. One morning, when the pressure became too great, Barbara Stagger rose and took careful aim. The forensic evidence was
Nothing that can be
compelling.
done?
The actual bullet trajectory did not agree with Barbara Stagger's story. Neither did the spent shell's ejection path. When the district attorney played the haunting tape of Russell Stagger's suspicions, it sealed Barbara's fate.
Oh, it had traumatic impact. Hearing it in court, I mean, this is the first time that I know of that a homicide victim actually had his day in court and testified from the witness stand, because it was just as if Russ himself was there.
Though Barbara Stagger may have dreamed of gold, she was led away in chains of steel. Based on the forensic evidence, she was convicted of the first-degree murder of her husband and sentenced to life in prison. A shooting death leaves obvious clues behind, but killing with kindness can go undetected, sometimes for years.
Well, darling, what did you think?
In April of 1989, Reverend Dwight Moore and his new wife Blanche were driving home to North Carolina after their honeymoon. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they were happy to be making a fresh start.
It gave us a break.
All was wedded bliss. Until on the Cape May Lewis ferry, Reverend Moore fell gravely ill. Blanche drove her husband home to Winston-Salem determined to nurse him back to health.
Hello, sweetheart.
She was a fine cook and thought that some of her good food would do the trick.
Oh my gosh.
Despite her care, her new husband's condition grew worse. Finally, he was rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe abdominal cramps. His doctor believed he had come down with an intestinal flu. But the Reverend told him his symptoms began shortly after he'd cleaned his garage of old household chemicals. He believed that something there had made him ill. Or perhaps it was the chemicals he'd recently sprayed on his lawn. Doctors performed a series of tests to determine what he may have been exposed to. The results revealed a shocking level of arsenic. Because arsenic poisoning is uncommon, North Carolina's chief medical examiner, John Butts, was called to investigate where the toxin may have come from. He didn't believe it could have entered Reverend Moore's system from cleaning his garage.
Arsenic is used in some fungicides, insecticides, and so there are possibilities for unintentional or accidental poisonings, but they're quite rare.
Arsenic is a highly toxic metallic element. Everyone has traces of it in their body, but Reverend Moore demonstrated an almost superhuman tolerance to it. He consumed enough to kill 10 men. It would be almost impossible to accidentally ingest that much of the poison.
There are certain medications that do contain arsenic. They're usually mainly in veterinary medicine against certain kinds of parasites, but there are very, very few medications, almost no medications that would be used in this country for humans that would contain arsenic.
His family gathered at his bedside, not sure if the Reverend would survive one of the highest levels of arsenic poisoning on record.
You told me he was fine.
He was. I brought a little sample to my husband.
Slowly, he regained his strength, fortified by some of his new wife's home cooking.
Oh, that's wonderful.
The fact that he'd survived this long suggested that he built up a tolerance through many small doses over a period of time. In other words, he may have been systematically poisoned. His ordeal wasn't over yet. Further tests showed that his arsenic levels were increasing while he lay in the hospital. Suspecting foul play, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation cleared Reverend Moore's room and posted a guard at the door.
I'm gonna have to ask everyone to leave the room and go down to the waiting room.
The patient was to eat no more food brought from outside the hospital. Investigators had every indication that he was being poisoned by someone he knew, someone he trusted, perhaps even someone in his own family. Their first suspect was his son, a biochemist. He'd have the know-how to do it, but he didn't have the opportunity to administer the poison.
This is with your new stepmom.
While police worked to protect Reverend Moore, the hospital staff worked to cure him. He was treated with a chelating agent, a compound that bonded with the arsenic in his body to flush it out of his system. The treatment was as painful as the poison. Meantime, investigators interviewed him to determine some clue about who might have been poisoning him. As the conversation turned to his family, Moore described his courtship with Blanche. One detail caught the detective's attention. Blanche's previous boyfriend, Raymond Reed, had died of a disease with all the symptoms of a serious stomach flu, symptoms very similar to what the Reverend was suffering from.
Was there anything
Investigators
else about,
began to delve into Blanche's
any
past.
interest or
I don't think
anything
so.
suspicious?
No.
Oh, good morning, Blanche. How are you?
She had met her former boyfriend, Raymond Reed, while working in the grocery store he managed.
Didn't? No.
They had been together for 15 years when Reed was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a debilitating nerve disease that attacks the spinal cord. It begins as numbness and can progress to paralysis and sometimes death. But another frightening aspect of Guillain-Barré is that it's the most common misdiagnosis for long-term arsenic poisoning. To test that theory, investigators requested Reed's complete medical records. While they waited, they collected a sample of Reverend Moore's hair to see how long he'd been poisoned.
More if you take and close that one.
Hair can be a very valuable substance for testing in cases of arsenic poisoning because as the hair grows, any arsenic that's present in the blood at that time will get deposited into the roots of the hair.
How you doing?
Like a modern-day Delilah, Blanche thought that by cutting her husband's hair, she'd weaken the state's case against
You're gonna
her.
be the best-looking guy in the neighborhood.
But when she brought her brother to the hospital to give Reverend Moore a close trim, she was too late. Investigators had already gathered the sample they needed. When Reverend Moore's hair was tested, it was polluted with arsenic from follicle to tip, meaning he'd been fed a steady diet of the toxin. He'd had 2 large doses 7 and 8 months earlier, in November and December 1988. He'd spent time in the hospital, but the poison went undetected. The same couldn't be said for Raymond Reed. When his medical records arrived, investigators made an alarming discovery. He'd been done in by a clerical error. At one point during his hospitalization, his doctors had ordered a test for heavy metals. But the results were temporarily lost in a blizzard of paperwork. In the interim, Reed died. 3 years later, when detectives were looking into Blanche Moore's past, doctors and police finally saw those results. Raymond Reed had been poisoned. It appeared that Blanche was seasoning her dishes with more than just sugar and spice. In North Carolina, investigators suspected that Blanche Moore was a serial poisoner. According to Forsyth County District Attorney Vincent Rabel, Moore had profited from the death of her boyfriend, Raymond Reed.
She got him to put her into his will during the time that he was in the hospital being poisoned. She was almost destitute financially until Mr. Reed died.
Very nice family.
Detectives had only their suspicions to guide them. If Blanche had really poisoned Reed, the evidence was buried with him. Now, investigators literally had to dig for what they needed to make their case.
Until this happened.
Okay.
Yeah,
Though arsenic poisoning is rarely suspected, it is easy to find once you know what to look for. The element lingers in the body long after it's finished its deadly work. The SBI got permission to exhume Reed's body.
Well, the major trail that arsenic leaves is that it doesn't go away. Arsenic binds to the tissues. It's a heavy, described as a heavy metal. It's an element. It's sort of the ideal thing to have to go look for because it will be there.
A large, recently consumed dose of arsenic will show up in stomach x-rays. Another telltale sign can appear as discolored bands running across fingernails and toenails. Reed's body bore these marks. The most accurate way to determine the presence of arsenic in remains is to perform the Reinsch test. In the medical examiner's office, tissue samples were taken from the body of Reed. The samples were then dissolved in acid, and a copper wire was placed in the resulting solution. If arsenic is present, it will attach to the wire, turning it black. The test was positive. Judging from Reed's hair samples, he had been poisoned for 6 months before he died. Further tests confirmed the diagnosis.
But when we ran the concentrations of arsenic on his tissues, he had very high levels, and certainly in levels that were associated with toxicity, fatal levels, potentially lethal levels.
Investigators now had 2 poisoned men, and one of them was dead. The only link between them was Blanche Moore. To Blanche's friends, this appeared to be a run of bad luck. But to detectives, Blanche seemed very lucky indeed to have dodged suspicion for so long. Once Reed had gone on to his reward, Blanche inherited hers, $80,000. But Reed wasn't necessarily her first victim. Investigators learned that 13 years before Reed's illness, her first husband, James N. Taylor, also died a mysterious, lingering death. His body was exhumed. It, too, tested positive for arsenic poisoning. The pattern was irrefutable. In Blanche's world, it appeared that the way to a man's heart and his money was through his stomach.
Yes.
But Blanche's current husband, Reverend Moore, was even bigger game. His insurance and assets made him worth $250,000 dead. But she couldn't collect it yet. Reverend Moore was still fighting for his life. Doctors usually do not suspect poisoning until it is too late. But unlike Taylor and Reed, Reverend Moore lived to count his blessings. The forensic evidence helped agents follow Blanche's well-worn trail of murder. She lured her victims to their deaths, pretending to nurture them during their moment of need. Blanche kept bringing food to Reed until she killed him.
My sweetheart, I brought you your favorite dessert.
Doubtless, she had planned to serve Reverend Moore the same fate.
Your favorite dessert.
Even though the minister's health no longer hung in the balance, the state's case against his wife certainly did.
Good?
They needed to prove she was a serial poisoner.
That's the best thing I've had in a while.
And we were very much concerned that she would weave her web of deceit and charm with the jury and convince them that she was not to blame.
Hi, Mrs. Moore. Hi, Detective.
Starting with her arrest for the murders of James Taylor and Raymond Reed, she refuted all charges, claiming she was the victim of a massive conspiracy.
Not me.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you.
When she took the stand, she denied bringing any food outside the hospital and accused many nurses and doctors of lying about her and accused them of falsifying medical records that were created at the time, which reported that she was feeding the patients food from home.
More than 50 witnesses from several hospitals clearly remembered Blanche's facade of kindness and her culinary largesse. In truth, Blanche had been cooking like a fiend. Her own testimony cued the jury that she was lying. But it took careful forensic analysis of all the evidence to prove it.
Do you want to know a little bit about
Blanche
the background?
Moore was convicted of first-degree murder for poisoning Raymond Reed.
Since you've given me all this...
She was also indicted for assault with a deadly weapon upon Reverend Moore.
I'm a suspect.
He survived the attack and was soon divorced from his murderous bride. But Blanche Moore was fated to get a dose of her own medicine. The judge sentenced her to death by her choice of poison gas or lethal injection. Because she was already on death row, she wasn't prosecuted for the death of her first husband, James Taylor. "60% of women who kill use poison. It destroys the victim from within, while it preserves the killer's veneer of innocence. But the most subtle murderer is one who never even goes to the scene of the crime. On January 21st, 1992, a difficult land and air search for a missing man near Kinston, North Carolina, came to a gruesome end. Authorities had finally found the body of Billy White, a successful life insurance salesman. He had been gunned down next to his van on a lonely dirt road. The victim's pockets were turned inside out. His wallet was empty. At first glance, robbery appeared to be the motive. State Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Ken Raper was called to the scene. He didn't have much to go on.
It appeared he'd been shot twice, once in the chest and once in his lower left side. It was a shotgun. I thought at the time it was probably double-aught buck or maybe triple-aught buck.
Jay, you have 2 wounds here.
But there were no shell casings at the scene.
What, 20 feet from the victim?
The only clue left behind was a single tire track in the mud near the victim's head. It was carefully photographed from all angles for comparison in case a suspect's car was found. Investigators spoke with the victim's wife, Sylvia White. She told them she believed her husband was killed on his way to see a new client.
Businessman.
Sylvia sometimes worked as her husband's secretary. She told police that a man named Timmy Connors had called her about buying a large insurance policy. She had referred Connors to her husband so he could close the sale. It was well known that Billy would drive anywhere to meet a client. His eagerness might have led him to his death.
He was a nice guy, a little bit quiet.
Police interviewed the victim's co-workers.
To work with his clients, so he wasn't around that
None
much.
had ever seen Connors.
Yes, I am. How can I help you?
Excuse me,
And Sylvia's only contact with him had been over the phone.
Mr. White had the opportunity to talk to him.
It wasn't much to go on, but the mysterious client was the only lead police had. The SBI reached out to the community for tips through television and newspaper ads. Before long, an anonymous informant called the police with a tip. He told them that a thin, long-haired carpenter had been soliciting people to murder Billy White. The informant told them the construction site where this person worked, but he didn't know the man's name.
What are you working on?
Investigators went to the construction site, but found no one who matched the description. At the same time, investigators worked with local law enforcement to go through mugshots, hoping to make an ID.
How you doing, Jay? What's going on? Hey, Joe, I need you to prove something.
Police learned while interviewing members of Sylvia White's family that she had hired a man named Linwood Taylor to do some work for her. Taylor's mugshot matched the description. Investigators also found that he worked at the job site mentioned by the informant. Taylor was called in for questioning. At first, he denied knowing the Whites, but investigators knew that was a lie and told him so. Eventually, he confessed to committing the murder. He said the motive was money. He was hired to kill Billy White. He admitted that the person who planned the whole thing was Sylvia White. SBI agent Eric Smith was present at Taylor's interview.
He said he had known Sylvia White for about a year, and that during that time she had told him stories of her husband's poor treatment. He had abused her and things of that nature. Mr. Taylor said he developed a lot of sympathy for Miss Sylvia White, but at this time, when we interviewed him, he said a lot of the stories or scenarios she had given him, he didn't believe any longer.
Taylor alleged that Sylvia had offered him $20,000 and a minivan if he would kill her husband. He said he would do it, but couldn't muster the courage. Sylvia grew impatient. Then she divulged a secret to him.
She basically told him if he couldn't do it, she'd do it herself. That she had done it before, and she had had a stepchild that she felt wasn't right, so she put a bag over its head until it stopped breathing.
The death of Sylvia's stepson 10 years earlier had been attributed to an accident. If Taylor's allegations about Sylvia were true, then the grieving widow would be unmasked as a cold-hearted killer who would stop at nothing to achieve her ends.
She came to me.
Now they had to gather tangible proof that she was involved in the killings.
For what? $3,000.
Yeah, I've got Baskin coming up here. Yeah,
In Taylor's confession, he told police that his uncle, Ernest Basden, was also involved in the murder of Billy White.
Mr. Basden is here.
Hello, Mr. Basden. Thanks for coming in. Okay. Why don't you have a seat?
Basden was called to the station.
With Mr. Taylor yesterday. And,
At first, he denied killing the insurance salesman.
He comes back, and then he...
But then, like his
gives me this
nephew,
ring.
he realized that honesty is the best policy. He too confessed to the killing. He told investigators that he had pulled the trigger himself. He had needed the money, Sylvia White's money. Now, police had two independent confessions, and both of them implicated the victim's widow. Her money had paid for her husband's assassins, but it couldn't buy their silence. Agents still had to back up the confessions with solid evidence if they were to build a case against Sylvia White. All they had to link the men to the crime were the tire tracks lifted from the scene. A search warrant was obtained to examine the tires on Linwood Taylor's cars.
They towed a Cutlass and a Camaro, and when I arrived, I walked over and looked at the tire treads, the tires themselves on both vehicles, and then determined that we need to take the ones off of the Camaro, that they indeed were consistent with the tread design that I had observed at the scene that day.
An SBI laboratory examination of his tire treads confirmed that Taylor's car had been at the scene of the murder. Next, detectives went to Taylor's house, where they uncovered treasure among the trash.
At Taylor's house, the crime scene investigators went out, and what they found was a trash pile in the rear where trash had been burned, and they were able to discover the remaining portions of several shotgun shells in the fire. The plastic portion had been burned, destroyed, but the brass casing was still there.
Presumably, these were the spent shells missing from the murder scene. The SBI seized the shells for analysis, but they still didn't have the murder weapon. Taylor and Basden said they had cut up the shotgun with a hacksaw, embedded it in a bucket of cement, and hurled it off a bridge.
We went out to the Noose River area, and the divers went in the water, and within 5 to 10 minutes, they had located the bucket on the north side of the bridge, just as Mr. Taylor had described, filled with cement.
Now, police literally had concrete evidence to support Taylor's story, but they still had to prove it was the murder weapon. Because it could no longer be fired, similar guns were test-fired at the SBI lab. Ballistic tests verified Taylor's story about the distance from which White had been shot. Taylor and Basden were now firmly implicated. But connections between Sylvia White and the conspiracy were still weak.
Okay, Miss White. So,
Sylvia had insisted that she didn't know Taylor.
He sounds
And yet
white.
investigators had witnesses who had seen them together.
And what did he take off? Were you aware of him?
Taylor admitted receiving a partial payment of $1,500 from White several days after the murder. Detectives traced the trail of cash back to its source.
A friend of the family and business partner of Mr. White had given Sylvia $1,500 a few days earlier. We were able to locate a bank that had cashed that check, which Miss White had endorsed. Mr. Taylor told us that the money he received was in an envelope, a banking envelope.
It was from the same bank that had cashed Sylvia's check. Taylor also told police that before Sylvia hired him, she had tried to kill her husband herself. She told him she'd read up on poisonous plants at the library. She tried feeding some to him, but they only made him ill. Investigators knew that if they could link Sylvia to books on poisons, they'd be able to prove that she intended to kill her husband.
And this one.
SBI agents went to the library to search for clues. There they found several volumes on poisonous plants. One book had missing pages. According to the index, those pages dealt with water hemlock and poison hemlock, plants common to the area. Agent Smith had the book analyzed for fingerprints.
I told him it was a 50-50 shot, but it was something that we really needed to connect Miss White to this murder. And he collected it, removed it from the library, and sent it to the lab.
A palm print was found inside the book next to the missing pages. A comparison with Sylvia White's print showed a perfect match. Step by step, the State Bureau of Investigation built their case against Sylvia White and her co-conspirators.
The evidence in this case from our SBI laboratory conclusively tied Linwood Taylor's vehicle to the crime scene. The story provided by Sylvia White to Linwood Taylor about Timmy Connors were able to corroborate through interviews. The final item was Sylvia White's palm print in the book on poisonous plants in North Carolina that conclusively tied her to the book.
The collected evidence positively implicated Sylvia White in the death of her husband. As the forensic evidence was pieced together, the full conspiracy came out. Basden said that his nephew, Linwood Taylor, had approached him about the murder at a party in October of the previous year. But the offer fell on deaf ears until Basden fell on hard times. In January, he agreed to do the job for money. Taylor, posing as Tim Connors, had already established a phone rapport with Billy White. Counting on the insurance salesman's willingness to go anywhere to clinch a deal, Taylor lured his victim to the remote dirt road.
Tim Connors. Oh, okay.
All right.
There, Basden ambushed White and pulled the trigger. They took the salesman's cash and collected the spent shell casings. Then they fled to Taylor's house, where they burned the shells and their clothing. But there was still more evidence to destroy. Taylor sawed the shotgun into pieces and embedded them in the cement. Then they ditched the gun in the river. That done, Taylor and Basden thought they were in the clear. But investigators caught up with them, and with Sylvia White. The case against the widow was now solid, but even so, Sylvia White may have gotten away with murder after all, at least so far. To strengthen their case against her, the SBI checked Taylor's story that Sylvia had smothered her stepson 10 years earlier.
We exhumed the body and transported it to Chapel Hill, and the results of that medical examination revealed injuries to young Billy White that had been sustained prior to his death, for which there was no documented medical treatment. One of those injuries was a fracture to the skull.
A plastic bag was also found in the child's windpipe. The victim was clearly murdered. Before the trial for her husband's murder commenced, Sylvia White was convicted of the murder of her stepson. She received a life sentence. But she wasn't out of the woods. With Linwood Taylor's confession and the forensic evidence that backed it up, Sylvia White had no defense. In 1993, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of her husband and was sentenced to another life term plus 10 years. Linwood Taylor and Ernest Basden also were convicted of first-degree murder. Taylor got life. For pulling the trigger, Basden was sentenced to death. Sylvia White took a business-like approach to killing her husband. She hired someone else to do the work for her, leaving herself one step removed. Blanche Moore and Barbara Stagger had other techniques for distancing themselves from their crimes. Blanche Taylor Moore posed as the nurturing figure as she fed poison to her victims. And Barbara Stagger killed through feigned incompetence, staging her murders to look like tragic accidents. In each case, forensics told a different story. Women may not be as outwardly violent as men, but they can be as effectively lethal. Police are just now starting to notice it. But whether a killing is stealthy or obvious, discreet or bloody, when forensic science is brought to bear on the case, the odds of bringing a female murderer to justice are equally good. A deadly house fire in Boise, Idaho claims the lives of a father and his 2 young stepchildren. As investigators sift through the ashes for answers, they uncover evidence that the blaze was no accident. In Northern California, a man is reported missing, and all indications suggest a tragic accident is to blame. But a routine investigation soon exposes a web of deception, fraud, and possibly murder. When money is at stake, some predators will stop at nothing to exploit another's trust. But even the most complex schemes can't survive the scrutiny of those determined to find justice for victims who have been fatally betrayed. Nestled in the western foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Ada County, Idaho is home to the state capital of Boise. It is also home to some 400,000 residents who work, live, and play here.
This is the fire department.
In the pre-dawn hours of February 10th, 1992, emergency dispatchers received a 911 call. A man reported that his house, a 2-story duplex, was on fire. And he believed a family of 4 who shared the house was still trapped inside. Within minutes, firefighters and emergency units from the surrounding area responded to the call. Fire and smoke consumed the duplex. Firefighters struggled to bring the first-floor blaze under control. Rescue workers fought their way through the flames and thick smoke to see if anyone had been trapped inside. In a second-floor bedroom, they discovered a man lying motionless on the bed. A young girl was found on the floor a few feet away. As the search continued, firefighters recovered the body of a young boy in a nearby bedroom. All of the victims were rushed outside for treatment. But despite the rescue workers' efforts, all 3 were pronounced dead at the scene. The man who lived in the separate residence inside the duplex told police that around 4 a.m. he was awakened by his smoke alarm. He tried to wake up the other family, but got no response. He identified the victims as 34-year-old Randy Rowe and his 2 stepchildren. He didn't know the whereabouts of the children's mother, Robin Rowe, who also lived at the residence. Then, 2 women arrived at the scene. One identified herself as Robin Rowe. Visibly shaken by the news, emergency workers escorted the young mother away from the house. Her friend, Joan McHugh, told police that Robin had fallen asleep at her house earlier that evening. Robin had awakened her just a short while earlier and wanted to return home. She had a premonition that something bad had happened to her family. All of the victims' bodies were removed from the scene and transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Now, Fire Marshal Doug McGrew began looking for clues to tell him how and why the fire started.
We started looking into the ignition source of the fire by doing, like we do on all fires, we do an exterior walk around of the building, we look and see where the least damage is, we go there, and we start working towards the areas where the most damage occurred. Once we get into that area, then we start digging down through and layering through the debris and trying to determine exactly what ignited the fire.
Almost immediately, investigators made a strange discovery. The circuit breaker that controlled power to the family's smoke alarm was in the off position. But that did little to explain how the fire started. And because the damage was so extensive, finding those answers would take time. Within hours, autopsies were performed on Randy Rowe and the 2 children. The medical examiner found lethal amounts of soot and carbon monoxide in each of the victims' lungs and mucous membranes. He concluded that all 3 had died as a result of smoke inhalation caused by the fire. As the search for the fire's cause continued into the morning hours, arson investigators sifting through the ashes made a troubling find. On the carpet and in a charred pile of laundry, they discovered burn patterns suggesting a flammable liquid had been poured over the area. And the spot was just inches away from vents that circulate air throughout the residence. Investigators collected several pieces of the charred remains for further analysis. All indications were pointing to arson. And that suggested that the fire that had claimed the lives of the 2 young children and their stepfather had been intentionally set. To find out, State Fire Marshal Don Dillard delivered the charred samples collected from the house to the Idaho State Police Crime Lab, located in Pocatello. By comparing a burned sample believed to contain an accelerant to one that was untouched by the fire, he hoped criminologists could find answers.
What I've asked our criminologists to do is to compare the 2, what we feel the one to be evidence, and then the one we feel probably doesn't have any kind of an accelerant on it, and she compares those 2, and by doing that, hopefully comes to the conclusion that there either is or isn't an accelerant involved in the case.
Forensic examiner Susan Williamson began testing the samples for the presence of an ignitable liquid. First, Williamson inserts a strip of charcoal ribbon in the sealed cans that contain the charred samples. Then, the can is placed in a chamber and heated for several hours. If any flammable substance is present, the heat will turn it into vapor, which will then be absorbed by the charcoal strip. Once the evidence has been heated, the charcoal strip is removed from the can. To transform any trapped vapors back into a liquid, solvents are then added to the strip. The resulting liquid is then subjected to sophisticated detection equipment that measures for the presence of known flammable substances. When the process was completed, Williamson analyzed the results.
One of the samples contained an ignitable liquid. And in this case, I identified a heavy petroleum distillate. And heavy petroleum distillates include things like kerosene, number 2 and number 1 diesel fuel, and fuel, heating fuel oil, and so forth.
The analysis had exposed the deadly fire as an act of arson. And more disturbing, it had exposed a triple homicide. Forensic examiners had exposed a house fire in Ada County, Idaho, that had claimed 3 lives as a triple murder. The findings were passed on to homicide investigators. Looking for answers, detectives turned to Robin Rowe, the wife and mother of the 3 victims. When asked why she wasn't at the residence on the night of the fire, Robin explained she had been staying at her friend's house. Over the past few months, her marriage had been falling apart.
Well, that was the strange thing.
In fact, Robin believed that her husband Randy might have intentionally set the deadly fire. She said that recently, Randy had become increasingly abusive toward her. The smallest things would set him off, and he couldn't seem to control his anger, even in front of the children. Robin claimed that on one occasion, Randy had struck her so hard she was forced to go to the hospital. Several hours before the fire, Randy had called her at her friend's house and demanded that she come home. When she refused, he threatened that she would never see him or her children again. Though it appeared Randy Rowe had made good on his threats, the story troubled veteran detective Gary Rainey.
Any parent is protective over their children, and had he been this abusive parent, any reasonable spouse would have wanted to remove the kids from that situation. Her story was that he was only abusive with her and not with the kids. That's not the norm, and certainly in law enforcement we recognize that abusive personality, that violent personality, the anger control problems is not going to just be focused on one particular person, especially with those pre-teen age kids who sometimes anger parents pretty easily.
With their suspicions raised, police wanted to learn more about the Rowe's marriage and corroborate Robin's alibi. They began with Joan McHugh, the woman who had been with Robin at the time of the fire.
Well, there was some abuse problems.
Because of Randy's abuse, Robin, she said, had been staying with her. That night, Robin had fallen asleep on her couch around 11 p.m.
And then,
Joan went to bed a short while later and never heard anything to suggest Robin ever left the apartment. Joan had no doubt that Robin was a victim of domestic violence.
And she said that it had been going on for quite a while, but she had never said anything to anyone. And it just seemed to escalate over a period of, I don't know, about 4 or 5 weeks. And a few times she came here, 10 or 11 o'clock with the children, because they were escaping from Randy.
The information gave Robin Rowe a solid alibi for the time of the 3 deaths. And the result of the forensic analysis had made it plausible that Randy Rowe had in fact killed himself and his 2 stepchildren in a vengeful act of rage. But that theory would not go unchallenged.
I learned that there had been some domestic violence going on. But then as a couple other people called, and I learned that there wasn't domestic violence going on according to them. And so it just started not adding up very well.
To learn more, police brought in Randy Rowe's sister to answer questions.
Any signs that Robin or the kids were the victims of any kind of violence, any bruises by anybody?
She didn't believe that Robin was the victim of domestic violence, as she had portrayed herself to be.
Ever any discussion?
Though Randy and Robin had begun to fight more and more, he was not a violent person. The kids were Randy's life. His sister knew that he never would have harmed them. And according to the sister, Robin treated Randy as little more than her kid's babysitter. As a result, Randy talked openly about the possibility of divorce. But he loved the children as if they were his own. And the kids made it clear that they didn't want Randy to go.
The children had, at one time, reportedly told Robin that they wanted to stay with Randy and not go with her. And of course, they were Robin's natural children and not Randy's.
To resolve all of the conflicting information about the couple, investigators decided to take a closer look into Robin Rowe's background. What they found was shocking. According to records, Robin had tragically lost a son nearly 15 years earlier. Her 6-year-old boy had died in a suspicious fire at her California home. Arson investigators were never able to determine a cause of the fire. But for Idaho police, the similarities between the tragedies had to be more than coincidental. Robin Rowe was now emerging as the prime suspect in the deaths of her husband and 2 children. But with an airtight alibi and no obvious motive to explain such an unthinkable crime, police knew that proving it would not be easy. Police in Ada County, Idaho, struggled to find answers in a deadly house fire that had claimed 3 lives. Robin Rowe, the wife and mother of the victims, had an airtight alibi for the night of the murders. But all of the evidence was pointing to her as the prime suspect. What investigators needed was proof. Looking for potential clues, they began reviewing statements made by Robin's friends and family.
Husband's kids.
They found that one friend had stated that a few days prior to the fire, Robin had mentioned that she had rented a storage unit and had taken some of her belongings there. The timing of the rental was too close to the murders for police to ignore. Detective Gary Rainey followed up on the lead. Soon, he was able to locate the unit that Robin had rented. With a warrant in hand, investigators were dispatched to the storage unit. There, they found boxes of personal papers belonging to Robin. Among the items was an envelope filled with several $100s in cash and bingo receipts from the YWCA where Robin Rowe worked. Police also collected several life insurance policies taken out on Robin Rowe's husband and her 2 children. Robin was listed as the sole beneficiary on all of the policies, and she stood to gain more than $275,000 from the 3 deaths. It was powerful circumstantial evidence of murder.
One of the most disturbing facts being that she took out the last 2 policies. She already had multiple policies, but Robin took out the last 2 policies on the children January 24th, and the fire was February 10th.
Still, it wasn't enough to take Robin Rowe into custody. Police began interviewing Robin's co-workers at the YWCA. The manager was surprised to learn that cash and receipts had been found in the storage facility. Robin had reported that proceeds from the Y's last bingo game had been destroyed in the house fire that killed her family. Though authorities lacked hard physical evidence of murder, they now had proof of embezzlement. The prime suspect in the triple homicide investigation was placed under arrest and charged with grand theft. But police were a long way from proving that Robin Rowe was a cold-blooded killer. Hoping to generate a lead that could destroy her alibi, details of the crime were released through the media. A short while later, police got a tip. A local newspaper delivery man called and told police that he remembered something unusual on the night of the fire. He said that while making deliveries around 4 a.m. that morning, he saw a car driving away from the duplex. He wasn't sure of the make of the car, but he described it as a late model 4-door with rectangular taillights. Detective Ken Smith asked the delivery man to come down to the station.
We had, prior to his arrival at the sheriff's office, had arranged to have vehicles similar to Robin Rowe's vehicle in the back lot, and Robin Rowe's vehicle was in the back lot. We walked him into the lot and asked him to look for vehicles that, or look and see if there were any vehicles that matched the description of the vehicle that he had seen in the subdivision on the morning of the fire. When he observed Robin Rowe's vehicle, he immediately pointed to that vehicle and stated that it was the same body style, same color, and resembled the car that he had seen.
You sure? Definitely.
The witness had placed a car similar to Robin Rowe's near the crime scene just a short while before fire consumed the duplex. Detectives still had to overcome a major obstacle. Robin's friend, Joan McHugh, had provided her with a solid alibi for the time of the homicides. Though police didn't think Joan was lying, they theorized that Robin had managed to slip out of the apartment undetected. Detective Gary Rainey was determined to find out.
I devised a scenario to try to prove or disprove Robin's presence in the apartment, and that was to have Joan confront Robin with the idea that she got up in the middle of the night, 3:30 in the morning, which was the time that we knew about when the fire started, that Joan would tell Robin that she came downstairs to get a drink of water and Robin wasn't there.
When contacted, Joan McHugh agreed that the next time Robin called her from prison, she would tell her the false story and record the conversation. Joan was only too happy to cooperate.
I'm sure, I really shouldn't speak for Detective Rainey, but I'm sure that he believed that somewhere in the phone calls she would absolutely destroy all of her alibis. And I just knew that she was going to explain everything and he was going to feel like a fool because she was innocent. There is no way a mother kills her children. And so I agreed to tape the phone calls.
On the evening of February 20th, Robin called Joan from prison.
Yes, Robin.
There's something that I have to talk to you about. That morning, I came downstairs, and you weren't here, Robin. Where were you?
Yeah, I know. I went outside.
It wasn't the answer she expected. Robin repeated her story that at around 3:30 a.m. she was awakened by a strange premonition that something bad had happened to her family. But now, she added that she then contacted a psychiatrist and left the apartment to speak with her for over an hour. On tape, Robin had destroyed her alibi. Joan McHugh was devastated.
It was terrible. And I didn't know what to do after. It was on a tape recording. And it was like, you know, do I call Gary or do I just take this thing and throw it in the trash and no one will ever know? But I would have known. And it probably sounds dramatic, but Randy and the children deserve better than that. So I called Gary.
Police finally had enough evidence to charge Robin Rowe with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Based on the evidence, detectives believe that in the early morning hours of February 10th, Robin Rowe slipped out of her friend's house and returned to her own home. She turned off power to the smoke alarm. Then, driven by a twisted desire to cash in on her family's life insurance policies, she placed a pile of laundry near the air vents and set the deadly blaze. After murdering her husband and 2 children, Robin calmly returned to Joan McHugh's house to establish her alibi.
Psychological experts have described to me that it's simply a balance in her mind of what she personally is better off with, a husband and 2 children, or the proceeds of life insurance policies and the opportunity to move to a new state. And that she simply weighed those 2 things and decided that the money and the new life was what she wanted today.
Robin Rowe was convicted of arson and 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of her husband, Randy, and her 2 children. She was sentenced to death. Idaho police had to reconcile conflicting information to find the truth. In California, detectives must follow a complex maze in order to expose a murder. Known for its temperate climate and lush farmland, Yolo County, California offers a quiet, rural lifestyle, miles outside the state capital of Sacramento. But residents there are no strangers to tragedy. On the morning of February 5th, 1997, 911 dispatchers at the Yolo County Sheriff's Department received a call from a concerned mother.
Do you have a responsible on that?
She feared that her son was missing. Deputies responded to the home. Patty Howard told the officer that she hadn't seen or heard from her 18-year-old son, Nick, since the previous evening. Patty said that the night before, Nick had helped her close up the auto body shop that the Howard family owned. As they were leaving, Nick said he had to retrieve a wallet he had left behind at a nearby restaurant. He told his mother he would be home in a couple of hours and said goodbye.
He does have long, dark sideburns.
But around midnight, Nick called and left a message on the answering machine. He said he was having car problems and was running late. But he never made it home that night. The family was very close, and it was completely out of character for Nick not to call and check in. Missing teenagers often turn up within a few days. But for Yolo County Detective Larry Cecchetini, Nick Howard didn't seem to fit the profile of a typical runaway.
This is probably one of the closest knit families that I've ever seen. They just, from all indications, they were a very close, very loving family. For Nick to call and not come home was just something that had never happened before.
Investigators feared the teenager's car troubles had led to an accident.
10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10 10
Police, friends, and family retraced his usual route. But after 2 days, the search had turned up nothing. Then, 2 men out on the search flagged down a patrol car near the banks of the Sacramento River. They had discovered tire tracks that led from the shoulder of the road down toward the riverbank.
Right down up here? Right over here. Why do you think these are mixed?
I figured nobody else would be laying those tracks down there. I don't know.
One of the men, 42-year-old Ralph Marcus, said he was a close friend of the Howard family.
Charles 22, I think we have a 972 that went over the cliff. If you could start dark.
10-4.
Ralph said that he and his associate, Jake Stanton, were out looking for Nick when they came upon the tracks. Unsure if the discovery was related to Nick's disappearance, Detective Cecchettini was contacted. He knew that stretch of highway well, and the news was not encouraging.
That's what I was thinking. This strip of roadway is a winding strip of river road. There are no guardrails on our county side. Quite frequently, inattentive or sleepy drivers do go into the river.
Search and rescue units from the Yolo County Sheriff's Department and officers from the California Highway Patrol responded to the scene. The team followed the tracks down an embankment. They led to the water's edge and then disappeared into the river. Members of the Yolo County Boat Patrol and rescue divers began scouring the river. After several hours of searching, divers signaled they had found something. 16 feet below the surface, they had discovered a vehicle resting on the riverbed. A tow truck pulled the car from the muddy river. The vehicle matched the description of the one driven by Nick Howard. A wallet recovered from the passenger seat contained the driver's license of the missing teenager. Examiners began searching the vehicle for clues. On the floorboard, they found Nick's prescription eyeglasses. They were bent, as if his head had violently impacted the dashboard or the steering wheel. Then, police noticed that a film of oil coated the vehicle's interior. It appeared to have come from an opened container of motor oil located in the back seat. The vehicle was towed to a police impound lot for a more thorough examination. Officers and divers from the boat patrol continued searching the area for any signs of Nick Howard. But there was no trace of the teenager. And if he was unconscious and not wearing his seatbelt when he went into the river, the powerful currents had likely carried his body miles away. With so many unanswered questions, police looked for clues to explain the accident. But aside from the tire tracks at the side of the road, little else was found.
Usually if the vehicle went into the water at a high rate of speed, you're going to have a lot of broken rocks, you're going to have debris, possibly some skid marks, some significant physical evidence.
As the investigation continued, detectives received some unexpected information. Nick Howard's family had handed over some papers they found while going through his room. One was a life insurance policy in the teenager's name that was worth $850,000. There was also an uncompleted change of beneficiary form that listed Ralph Marcus, the man who had discovered the tire tracks at the river, as the new beneficiary. Police were surprised that someone as young as Nick Howard would have such a large insurance policy.
Essentially, he was spending a quarter of his monthly income on a life insurance policy, which struck us as odd. It's not something that, life insurance just isn't something that an 18-year-old thinks about, especially when it costs that amount of money.
Why don't you have a seat right there?
And that wasn't the only troubling news. An acquaintance of Nick Howard's came forward with information.
Tell me about Nick's life insurance.
He believed that Nick was alive and well. Recently, he said, the teenager had boasted that his life insurance policy would make him a millionaire.
He had this big policy.
All he had to do was fake his own death, disappear, and then have Ralph Marcus collect on the policy. A polygraph test later confirmed he was telling the truth. The frantic search for a missing teenager had taken an unexpected turn. Now, investigators had to consider that Nick Howard had staged the auto accident and his own disappearance. To find out, police enlisted the aid of the California Highway Patrol's Accident Reconstruction Unit. Using the tire tracks found by the side of the road as his guide, investigator Steve Walker surveyed the scene. Detailed measurements indicated that the car had left the road at a 45-degree angle, and there was no evidence of vaulting or bouncing onto the shoulder. That suggested the car was traveling no faster than 14 miles per hour when it left the road. It was unlikely that a sleeping or inattentive driver had caused the vehicle to end up in the river. And there was no evidence suggesting that a collision had taken place.
There was no debris, there were no fluids, stains on the roadway. There was nothing that you typically see in a traffic collision. It was very, very anomalous. And it likewise fit the idea that the car had not departed from the roadway in a violent manner, that it was set up to leave the roadway in a more controlled manner.
Police next examined the engine of Nick Howard's car, looking for any mechanical problems that could explain the accident. Almost immediately, they found a clue. A plastic bottle cap had been intentionally wedged into the engine's throttle, holding it open. And the cap had originated from the opened container of motor oil recovered from the vehicle's interior. With their suspicions raised, police turned to auto expert Charles Radford of the California Highway Patrol. To determine the significance of the findings, he conducted an experiment. He wedged the cap into the throttle of a car with a similar manual transmission engine. He put the car in gear and then turned on the ignition. The engine revved up to 6,000 RPMs and then lurched forward.
And we could get speeds in second of as high as 20 miles an hour, and in fourth gear it was approximately 15 miles an hour within a 100 to 150 foot range. What this shows is that it would be very easy for someone to be able to take a car and put it in the river by use of an oil bottle cap.
All of the evidence police had gathered now led them to believe that 18-year-old Nick Howard had in fact staged his own disappearance. And now he was wanted for questioning in the elaborate insurance fraud scheme. But so far, all efforts to locate the teenager had turned up nothing. Police in Yolo County, California continued their search for 18-year-old Nick Howard. While looking for answers, they uncovered evidence suggesting the teenager and his friend, Ralph Marcus, had staged the disappearance. It appeared to be an elaborate scam to collect on a life insurance policy worth $850,000. But with Nick Howard's whereabouts uncertain, police turned their focus to Ralph Marcus, the beneficiary of the insurance policy. A background check on the 42-year-old heightened Detective Larry Cecchettini's suspicions that the disappearance was in fact a hoax and that Ralph Marcus was somehow involved.
Ralph Marcus had done thefts, identity scams, insurance fraud, bankruptcy fraud. He was a drug runner.
Under questioning, Ralph Marcus denied any involvement in Nick's disappearance. And he knew nothing about any insurance scams.
Tell me about your relationship with Nick.
Ralph said he had been a friend of the Howard family for years. Nick was like a godson to him. He was shocked to learn that he was the beneficiary of Nick's life insurance policy. Ralph said he wasn't interested in the money. Police sensed he was lying. But with no hard evidence, they had no choice but to release him. The investigation was going nowhere. Then, on February 25th, 1997, 3 weeks after Nick Howard disappeared, Yolo County Police got a break. But it wasn't one they had expected. A man fishing on the Sacramento River had called police after discovering human remains. Less than a mile from where Nick Howard's car was found, police recovered the partially decomposed remains of a young man. The victim, found with a single glove on his right hand, matched the description of the missing teenager. And dental records later confirmed that Nick Howard had finally been found. With no obvious cause of death, the body was transported to the Yolo County Coroner's Office. There, forensic pathologist Dr. Brian Peterson began looking for answers.
Here's some pictures of the body, how we found them on scene.
A close examination of the glove and the clothing indicated that no traces of motor oil were present. And that suggested the victim was not in his car when it went into the water. For Detective Cecchettini, the findings didn't make sense.
A couple of things just didn't add up. For one, the body was wearing one glove, which we thought was somewhat unusual. I remembered that the car was coated with motor oil when we initially located it, but yet there were no traces of motor oil on the clothing. Granted, he'd been in the water for some time, but the traces of motor oil are not going to be entirely washed from the body.
Dr. Peterson next looked to establish a cause of death. Fluid found in the victim's lung suggested Nick Howard had drowned. But there was also something else.
Additionally, there were changes consistent with manual strangulation, bleeding inside the muscles of the neck.
Nick Howard had been murdered. For the Howard family and for investigators, the discovery was devastating. In addition to the tragic loss, it was now clear that Nick Howard had not staged his own disappearance. And Ralph Marcus was now the prime suspect in his death.
Now we have a body. We've pretty much determined that the body was not in the car when it went in. We have an $850,000 potential life insurance payout, and we have the beneficiary, and we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we get to the bottom line on this and get to the truth of what happened.
Police contacted the insurance agent in nearby Sacramento who handled Nick's policy. According to records, Nick came in a few weeks before he disappeared requesting that Ralph Marcus be named the new beneficiary. But he didn't have all of the correct paperwork, and the change was not completed. But Nick didn't seem to understand, and the agent believed that he left that day convinced that his policy had in fact been updated.
In the insurance agent's opinion, when Nick left, he was under the impression that the change was completed and that Ralph Marcus was the beneficiary.
Though incriminating, the information fell short of the smoking gun investigators would need to prove murder. Then they got a break. A witness asked Detective Cecchetini to meet him at a pier on the Sacramento River. Jake Stanton, the man who was with Ralph Marcus when the tire tracks were discovered at the river, believed he had important information about the case. Jake said that shortly after Nick went missing, Ralph had asked for his help in searching for the teenager. While driving along the Sacramento River, Ralph pulled up to the pier. He said it was one of Nick's favorite spots. As they searched the area, Jake saw Ralph Marcus walk to the end of the pier toward a black glove.
As Jake turns around, he sees Ralph ditch the glove off the top of the pier. Before Jake even says anything, Ralph mentions to him, "I was trying to get the glove."
Detectives showed Jake the black glove recovered from Nick Howard's body.
You ever see anything that looks like this?
He was certain it was identical to the one Marcus had kicked off the pier.
Jake was adamant about the fact that Ralph was trying to kick the glove off so that it could not be recovered. The significance of this is that we had never told anybody that when Nick was found, he was wearing one glove.
The information brought police one step closer to proving that Ralph Marcus had murdered 18-year-old Nick Howard. But so far, all of the evidence was circumstantial. Police in Yolo County, California were now certain that 18-year-old Nick Howard had been murdered for his life insurance policy, worth $850,000. All of the evidence suggested that Ralph Marcus, the beneficiary of the policy, was responsible. The suspect was brought in for another interview. Police showed him the black glove that had been recovered from the victim. Though witnesses saw Marcus kick an identical glove into the Sacramento River, he claimed he hadn't seen one like it before. Marcus continued to insist that he had no knowledge of Nick's life insurance policy and was in no way involved in his death. He pointed to the fact that he had gone to great lengths to help find Nick after he disappeared. But detectives believe that Ralph Marcus had only done that in order to divert attention from himself.
Thank you very much.
Authorities obtained a warrant to search the home Ralph Marcus shared with his mother. There, they found several documents relating to Nicholas Howard's insurance policy. And Marcus was in the process of filing a claim for the $850,000. The suspect was well aware of Nick's life insurance policy, something he had repeatedly denied. He was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Police believe that Ralph Marcus was able to get 18-year-old Nick Howard to agree to stage his own death after making him the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. But Marcus never intended to split up the money. Once the plan was in place, he beat and strangled the teenager, then tossed him into the river to die. After placing the teenager's wallet and glasses inside the vehicle, Marcus rigged the engine of Nick's car with an oil cap and sent the vehicle into the water, hoping his death would appear as an accident. Ralph Marcus was convicted of the first-degree murder of Nicholas Howard and sentenced to life in prison. Greed and self-interest can be strong motivations for murder. And when the killer is cunning, the truth can be elusive. But detectives and forensic scientists are dedicated to finding justice for unsuspecting victims who have found themselves betrayed.